Welcome back to the Barbell Medicine Podcast, where we bring modern medicine to strength and conditioning and strength and conditioning to modern medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and this is our third edition of our supercast, Ask Me Anything. So, what we do for our Barbell Medicine Plus subscribers is we have them ask us questions every month. They get their own forum, their own sort of protected space to ask us questions. We pick the best ones if there are too many questions, 'cause obviously, a finite amount of time that people are actually going to listen to us talk. So we pick the best questions. People can vote on them to make sure that we answer them. And then we answer them once a month, and it resets every month. So from the period of the 15th of one month to the 15th of another month, we just collect questions, then we answer them here. Now, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I'm not a Barbell Medicine Plus subscriber, how am I hearing this? Don't adjust your computer, don't adjust your phone or your radio, whatever. You're hearing this correctly. We just wanted to give you a preview of what we do as one of the sort of value adds to our Barbell Medicine Plus subscription. In addition to summaries, exclusive content, and other sort of things, we also have a protected forum on our new forum. So if you go on our website and you search for the forum, there's actually a hidden forum for our Barbell Medicine Plus subscribers where they can interact with us there as well. So no more happy talk. We're just going to get right into these questions. But first, I have to introduce my co-host on the other end of the line, the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. How's it going?
Hey, doing all right. Excited to knock out another edition of our AMAs.
There's some spicy stuff in here as well. But what I like to do is I like to do all of the legwork for the podcasts personally. I enjoy it. It's fun. It feels like I'm learning stuff every day, and then just spring it on you. And then we're just seeing how you respond to this. The good thing is, obviously, you're highly intelligent and very well read, and particularly from the medical and training and nutrition topics, you can pretty much just go off the top of the dome. But I like asking you hot takes
Sure.
periodically. So we'll see how many hot or maybe tepid takes that we can do on this particular episode. So let's get into it with the first question. This user asks, it is widely believed and also widely experienced that unilateral squat exercises, such as Bulgarian split squats, are extremely taxing. Why are they so hard? Is finding them hard a sign of lacking cardiovascular conditioning? Would the fact that heart and lungs become the limiting factor prompt you to not use them in a program? I actually thought this was an interesting question because it kind of dredges up some uncertainty when it comes into not only programming, but also like describing the response to training. So, fatigue, for example, I don't know how many thousands of times we've said the word fatigue on our podcasts, written about it in some of our ebooks that accompany our templates, certainly on our articles on the website that are available for free. I'm going to come right out and say this. There is no gold standard definition for exercise induced fatigue or fatigue at large. And that applies even into the medical realm when you ask a patient, hey, are you experiencing fatigue? Which you wouldn't say because you know already that, what am I even talking about when I say the word fatigue? But we keep saying this word, and it does kind of conjure up this problem with the definition. And so, because you can't define it, how do you measure it? And if you can't define or measure it, then like, what are you talking about? So when we say fatigue, right, this person used the term taxing, I think what they mean is they feel tired afterwards, right? And fatigue can be described as the subjective experience of tiredness and or reduced performance at a particular given effort level, right? So if you were able to squat, for example, or do Bulgarian split squats at body weight for a set of 10 on each side, at RPE 8, you feel like you could have done 2 more reps, then maybe the next set, if you were fatigued, it would be at a higher RPE, for example. Can also include the difficulty in completing the task, whether that's real or perceived, and so on. But again, there's no gold standard definition for exercise induced fatigue or fatigue at large. Now, in exercise, muscle fatigue has been defined as the inability of muscles to maintain a certain level of force production. Some of you may have listened to my rest period sort of monologue where I described all the data on rest periods and rest days. One of the very first descriptions of muscular fatigue, this guy every day for decades would effectively pull a weighted trigger to see how many times he could pull that weighted trigger before he was unable to do so. And he was one of the first people to describe like muscular fatigue or task fatigue. That said, I don't know that that's what this person is talking about, right? Something different. So it'd be hard to describe unilateral exercises like the Bulgarian split squat as more fatiguing than bilateral exercises using one of these definitions, though I think we can focus on why an exercise may be more difficult than another as a matter of practicality. If everyone is agreeing to that, nod your head silently. I can't see you at home, but I think that's what people are talking about. Why is this thing so hard? And like what to do about it? So my perception on this, I'll start and you can kind of see if you disagree anywhere, or you want to add some stuff. The first thing is any sort of novel or new movement are likely harder to perform in general than familiar ones. We have less efficient movement patterns, right? Your brain hasn't figured out how to like do the task in the smoothest, most repeatable way. And it also costs you more energy because there's less sort of movement economy. That's something you see in even like monostructural type conditioning elements like running. When people first start running, they're really bad at it. It costs them a lot of energy to do it. But as they get better, they become more economical with their efforts. You also have reduced strategies for movement. So, like when things start getting hard, muscles start getting a little bit tired, you don't have like a default go to for what to do then, right? And there's also a higher cost. And I put that on my outline in quotation marks. It costs you more, not just energy wise, but you incur more muscular damage, for example, with new movements as well versus familiar movements. And that's been documented via the repeated bout effect. So all of this sort of new exercise stuff can make unfamiliar exercises seem more difficult. And you could layer on even like a psychological component to that. If you perceive this new exercise to be very difficult because everybody on your social media feed has been saying Bulgarian split squats are death, and then you, for the first time, you see Bulgarian split squats pop up in your program, I suspect that would portend a worse outcome than if like the Care Bears were associated with Bulgarian split squats. Like every time you did a rep, we care. There was a little cartoon. Also with unilateral exercises, so one-sided exercises, there's a balance component, which, especially if somebody had some sort of balance deficiency, could certainly present an additional sort of issue and make this feel harder. The last thing that feels to me is probably the most causal is that people are doing more reps total for this, right? So by and large, Austin, when you program Bulgarian split squats, I assume it's similar to me. I'm programming these for 8 reps, 10 reps, 12 reps at a time, and that's for each leg. And so now you're talking about sets of 16, 20, 24. And yeah, there's a pretty decent, strength, stamina, cardiorespiratory sort of draw there that you have to be ready for compared to like you almost never would program a set of back squats for a set of 24. And so I think people are a little surprised when they do this effort and they're like, I just did 24 reps. I'm out of breath. Everything feels hard. Like what happened? It's like, no, it's just different than what you used to do. Does that kind of make sense to you?
Yeah, I am inclined to agree with most of what you said. I think the novelty and the balance component are things that really get fixed in pretty quick, in a short period of time. Once people have had a couple exposures to it, they can usually get the hang of it. But I think more of what this person is experiencing, I would say, is a combination of two things. The first is what you just mentioned, the fact that almost always it's going to be sets of higher repetitions. But the other is that if you compare these, relatively speaking, when people do these kind of single leg split squats or rear foot elevated, front foot elevated, whatever the case is, it's a little bit closer to like a constant tension movement. In other words, a lot of times people will just do these like rep after rep after rep, go right into them. Whereas like if you're doing a squat with the bar on your back and you stand up and you can lock out all your joints, your knees, your hips, and you can just kind of stand there a little bit more passively, so to speak, in between reps and catch your breath for only a set of 4 or 5 or 6 or something like that. That's a very different experience than, to your point, doing 12, reps per leg that are kind of in quick succession without that kind of like locked out resting position in between reps, for a newer movement, and then doing that on the other side right afterwards. I bet if you were to prescribe somebody to say to do even a set of 10 squats with a barbell on their back, and it should be like that kind of style of constant
Continuous
tension where
movement.
you never fully lock out at the top. You go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down without any standing up in between. Then this person would probably be similarly taxed, I would say, if not more so, because the absolute load is probably going to be a bit higher, even if the balance component is made easier in that situation. And to the last point in the question, I don't think that that is representative of a issue of the heart or the lungs. So the last part of the question was like, with the fact that the heart and lungs become the limiting factor. They are not the limiting factor here. Like the amount of reserve that your lungs have in terms of their ability to take in oxygen from the environment, even if you don't do conditioning, your lungs have way more capacity to take in oxygen. They are essentially never the limiting factor for you, especially when it comes to strength training. Much more, there are these, in terms of aerobic conditioning and VO2 max, assessments and things like that. There's like these central factors, yeah, like the pump, like your heart, for example. But there's more peripheral factors like your ability to use this oxygen and generate energy in your muscles, which is going to be more often a limiter in people who are poorly conditioned. So it's not your heart and lungs. I can tell you that with some degree of confidence, and even not knowing you right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what people see is like, their heart rate goes up and they're
Yeah.
breathing hard and they're like, well, it's got to be a cardiorespiratory like
Yeah.
limitation, which is not necessarily the case. Your body's just trying to figure out different strategies to provide your working muscles that you've been using
Yeah.
continuously with fuel. And it's like, well, you can't really overcome that. So this is kind of a predictable response. Now, when I personally do Bulgarian split squats, I have kind of shifted from how I've done them previously. Before, I would almost have the same experience. I'd be using, 65, 70-pound dumbbells, for example, doing Bulgarian split squats like that, 12 reps on one side or something like that, switch to the other side, do my 12 reps. And then afterwards, be like, man, I got to breathe hard just to catch up here. And I found that I wasn't getting very close to muscular failure, which was kind of one of the things I wanted. And I wasn't getting as much leg pump as I thought I should be getting from the amount of work I was doing. Now, I understand that the pump isn't necessarily correlated to great outcomes, like whatever, we can ignore that. But I figured maybe there's a better way to do this. What if I started doing these like I would be doing a set of squats, for example? So now I will stand up between each rep almost completely. And that's like my resting phase. Then I will do the Valsalva, do another rep, and go
Mm.
through that. Yeah, my set takes longer, but I'm handling, hundreds, 110s. I'm using straps, by the way, because it's not a grip exercise for me. And I feel like, and again, no real data to back this up other than my personal experience, that I'm getting a better sort of transference to stuff I do care about, like how strong my legs are, how big they are, and so on. And so the last part of the question was, would this, breathing hard, having a high heart rate, whatever, would that ever be a limiting factor for you to not program these Bulgarian split squats or unilateral exercises in a program, or even this type, maybe a higher rep set in general? In general, no, because I'm with you. I think like figuring out the movement pattern, figuring out the balance thing, though it's relatively adaptable for most folks. But if there's some underlying condition where it is not likely to be adaptable, so somebody with like, you have heart disease, you're on particular medications, and you cannot sort of, get your heart rate that high or whatever. And so having you do extended sets isn't really a great option. Well, sure, maybe we're going to do lower reps, sets of 5, for example. You can do Bulgarian split squats for sets of 5 on each side.
Yeah.
If somebody's got lung disease like COPD or whatever, same sort of deal. You can just lower the reps. You can also take rest periods between sides. One side for 10 reps, take a 2-minute break, do the other set for 10 minutes, take another 2-minute break, and keep going back and forth. There's nothing written in stone that you have to accomplish all this work within a particular time interval. But generally, I would still favor inclusion of unilateral exercise. Just lower the rep scheme if you have to, again, or add rest periods or potentially both.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, cool. Let's move on here to the second question. Oh boy, we're gonna kick up some dust here, some drama. All right, what are your thoughts on Dr. Gabriel Lyon's argument that we should reframe the health consequences of the obesity epidemic as due to individuals not having enough quality muscle tissue rather than individuals carrying too much adipose tissue or fat tissue? How would you talk to your clients interested in training for long-term health about prioritizing/maintaining healthy fat levels versus gaining muscle mass? That last sentence, I think, was written maybe a little backwards, but do you understand this the same way that I
Yes.
do? That Dr. Lyons is claiming that the biggest problem with obesity isn't that people are carrying too much body fat; it's just that they're under muscled. Am I crazy? Is
That
that
is
like
that does appear to me to be the claim.
Okay, well, we shall proceed then. So, right now, the prevalence of overweight and obesity is 73% among US adults ages 20 and older, and 36% among children and adolescents aged 2 to 19. That's based on the latest 2025 Dietary Guidelines Scientific Consensus statement that just came out a couple of days ago. Now, on average, individuals with obesity carry about 28% body fat for men and about 40% body fat for women. It's based on a study of over 18,000 adults through multiple ethnicities and age groups. And the amount of muscle mass that these individuals with obesity have is about 63 kilos for men and about 45 kilos for women. So just keep those numbers kind of marinating in your prefrontal cortex. Now, if we look at individuals with normal BMIs, so quote unquote normal weight individual, existing data sets show that those with a BMI less than 25, well, men on average have about 22% body fat and women have an average of about 34% body fat. They tend to carry about half as much muscle mass as individuals with obesity. So about 31 kilos for men and 21 kilos for women, though it can certainly vary based on group specifics. So what's their age, what's their ethnicity, what's their activity levels, nutritional status, disease status, and so on. So before we go further in this sort of explanation, to be very clear, individuals with excess body fat, whether it's overweight or obesity, carry more muscle mass, significantly more muscle mass than those with a normal BMI and normal body fat. It, any objections so far, Dr. Baraki?
I think I'm following your argument.
Okay. So, because adults with obesity tend to carry more muscle mass, they also tend to be stronger in an absolute sense. So, depending on what sort of muscle test you want to do, whether it's hand grip strength, if it's knee extension strength, whatever, they tend to do better on an absolute sense. So, it's not like they just carry all this extra muscle mass, but then can't use it. When normalized for lean body mass, these differences tend to disappear, meaning that it just really depends how much lean body mass that you have on board. We'll come back to that in a future question here about men versus women. But as far as why that happens, we don't know. Is there some training effect on muscles due to the excess adiposity, the excess weight that these individuals are carrying? Unclear. There's also some evidence that maybe carrying excess body fat might reduce the ability for individuals with excess body fat to actually recruit all of their muscles, but that seems to be related mostly to adolescents and young individuals rather than older individuals. But the point is, people with excess body fat are not under muscled by and large, and they're not under strong by and large. They're just carrying too much body fat. We can like reject her statement just flat out because it's just wrong. Now, I try to be charitable with her take, right? So maybe she's like, look, I'm giving up. I'm giving up. I'm throwing in the towel because obesity is so difficult to treat, particularly with lifestyle change alone. So that's diet and exercise. We can't fix it. We won't fix it until we change the environment. So I'm just throwing in the towel on that. So now I'm pivoting my concern to sarcopenia, the loss of muscle mass and function. That's my primary concern. So because I'm just giving up on weight loss, maybe I just need to promote people lift weights because sarcopenia is a big risk. And especially it's a big risk for people who have sarcopenia and obesity together, which is a specialized type of sarcopenia called sarcopenic obesity, which is again, reduced muscle mass and function plus excess body fat. There seems to be some additional functional limitations in those with sarcopenic obesity that may further reduce treatment options like exercise and also reduce their ability to live independently while also increasing the risk of disease due to the excess body fat itself. In other words, sarcopenia plus obesity have this synergistic effect when it comes to negatively affecting function and health outcomes. So if you gave up and you said, we can't fix the weight loss thing, we can't do it, I could see some sort of public health messaging about like, well, let's just get strong instead. But the idea that adults with overweight or obesity are under muscled to a greater degree than excess body fat is not based in reality. And so I just have to fully like reject what she's saying without this further caveat that says distinctly, I'm giving up on losing weight. We're just going to promote strength training. So I think we would both recommend exercise regardless, though exercise has a limited effect on body fat loss and weight loss in general. Its best effects are for improving health, function, and improved body composition. It does tend to make people more sensitive to feelings of fullness, so satiety signals, so people tend to eat less. It also tends to reduce some elements of metabolic adaptation, so people's metabolic rate and the amount of calories that they burn per day doesn't drop nearly as much. But training to gain muscle and strength is insufficient for body fat loss and health optimization in isolation. Rather, we would also add weight loss interventions to accompany exercise in those who are desiring weight loss. So, yes, you want the patient, the client, whatever level you're working in, to also be on board with this. You don't just say everyone needs to lose weight who's carrying excess body fat, for example. And the narrative would be about improving health and function through both, not focusing solely on weight loss or building muscle, these sort of outcome-based sort of thinking, but rather the process. How do we get this lifestyle to be default for you because we want to improve your health and function, make you feel better? And so this is where the hot take comes in, Dr. Baraki. Let's just say I am the genie from Aladdin, okay, and I can snap my fingers, and everyone does one of the following. Everyone either gains 10% muscle along with 10% body fat, because that is a very charitable ratio for people like seeking muscle gain to gain half muscle, half fat. Or in the second scenario, I snap my fingers, they lose 10% body fat and 2.5% muscle, which is not a great ratio, but is widely reported for people who do not exercise that that's the sort of ratio. What, Dr. Baraki, improves health the most?
Yeah. With no further caveats, questions, or criteria to this, specifically relating to like body fat compartment, subcutaneous versus visceral, without any of that, then I would say the latter, where everybody loses 10% body fat and sacrifices 2.5% muscle mass. I think net population-wide population health improves more than everyone gaining 10% muscle and 10% fat at the same time. Similarly, let's say it's, equally distributed or distributed in the way that they were already, genetically inclined to distribute their body fat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, just going through that thought experiment, which this is an answerable question, you could model this out in a number of different ways. And, 99 out of 100 times, it's going to come back in favor of losing body fat, not gaining muscle. And
Yeah.
it's not that, look, if there's anybody who's going to be championing muscle gain, resistance training, it's going to be us, not her. And I don't know her. I'm sure she's a very nice person. The majority of what she says with respect to training and these sort of interventions and its effect on public health are wrong. And I'm happy to debate her publicly. Let's go. Put us on Rogan. It'll be, it won't go well. It won't go well. I feel very confident in kind of how I've laid out this argument. So I can't really see how someone in good faith could say, the big problem with obesity isn't the excess body fat. It's carrying too little muscle. It's
Yeah.
like, what?
Yeah, no, I like the way you frame the case through the lens of like, well, okay, how much muscle do these folks have compared with folks who have normaler levels of body fat? The other thought that came to my mind, since as you mentioned, I'm doing more things off the dome here, my initial reaction to this was that it is both a testable claim and has been tested by way of
Yeah.
by way of obesity interventions, right? And so if in the context of obesity, the main problem, the central pathology was a lack of muscle mass and not the excess adipose, then interventions that lead to a change in those factors, you could observe what the outcomes are. And so when we intervene, either through lifestyle interventions and have people lose weight, which, as we've said before, typically comes with some loss of fat, some loss of lean body mass, including muscle and non-muscle related water and things like that, or obesity related medicines, which things like GLP-1 agonists, I mean, that's like the hysteria in those circles, is that they do lead to some loss of fat-free mass, which includes water, organ mass, things like that, some muscle mass, depending on the degree of resistance exercise. That tends to, there is some loss, some sacrifice there. And then, of course, metabolic bariatric surgery, leading to huge amounts of overall, weight loss, 30% body weight loss, something like that, which is obviously some of it's going to be fat mass, some of it's going to be muscle mass. And again, if the fundamental pathology here is these folks are under-muscled, all of these interventions should make people worse, should make them less healthy, right? They should have higher rates of disease, complications, death. They do not, right? Overall, this has been shown over and over again in all of these things that health improves with as modest of a weight loss, as we've said before, as like 5, 7.5, 10% weight loss. Detectable change improvements in health, be it blood pressure, blood lipids, insulin sensitivity, all of these other things, even though their muscle mass has, in most situations, decreased to some extent. And so that's another way that you could come at this and be like, well, it's been tested. And so we feel kind of obligated to reject that hypothesis, even though, yeah, big fans of getting people jacked, but that's not going to be the solution here.
Can you imagine like a 3-arm study, all right, with just tons of people, individuals with overweight and obesity, and one group did nothing, usual care, right? The second group, they got super physiological, so high doses of anabolic steroids so they could gain muscle mass, presumably, through resistance training, although they'll still gain muscle mass even if they don't. And then the third group got GLP-1 receptor agonists or, some other combined therapy, anti-obesity medication, plus resistance training. It's not even close as far as what the outcomes would be for not only survival, but also like other sort of metrics of health outcomes and function. Like it's not even close. And I can't get over this because to me, this is such a stupid take. It doesn't make sense. It's like, are you listening to yourself?
Yeah.
Like, and has no one at any point ever said, you sure? Are
Well,
you
I
sure?
will. There's one little caveat or pushback that I'm going to give you there. So there's a trial called the T4DM trial. It was run in Australia, about 1,000 men who had the specific details of the inclusion criteria are escaping me right now, but they were men who were either had prediabetes or recently diagnosed type 2 diabetes. They had an elevated waist circumference. And these men were randomized to either receive, they all got lifestyle interventions, and they were randomized to either receive testosterone therapy or placebo. And then they followed these folks for a couple years to look at the rates of progression from prediabetes to diabetes and various other metrics. And so in this study, these men who had insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, which is known to lead to decreases in testosterone, when they were put on testosterone, they did improve. Some of the men with prediabetes, they reverted to normal blood sugar levels. The rate of progression of diabetes was reduced. So there was some benefit there. However, one of the known effects of putting people on testosterone in this situation is not purely muscle gain, but they also lose fat. That's something else that happens when you put men with, testosterone deficiency on testosterone. So even in that situation, in your hypothetical thought experiment where say you do that, the effect is not isolated to just muscle gain. If you could put somebody on some intervention that just purely cranks up their muscle mass, that would be the more kind of
Yeah,
rigorous way to
myostatin
test this
inhibitor. Yeah.
question, right?
Yeah.
But even myostatin's a whole separate thing. But in the world where you purely increase muscle mass versus the world where you purely decrease fat mass in people with obesity and obesity-related complications and things like that, that's a scenario where I'm with you. There is no question that the loss of fat mass is going to have benefits that exceed those of the muscle gain.
Yeah. Maybe Gains RX gets rebranded and it's just a little bit of testosterone. It's a little bit of GLP-1 receptor agonists, a little blood pressure medication, and maybe
Yeah.
a little atorvastatin. And that's our man, we're changing the world. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. I've recently started using the Barbell Medicine app on Android. It is available for all our Green Bubble people. It is free download, and you can check out all of our stuff there. I really do like this app, but stumble over the session RPE that you can enter each training session. Could you tell us more about how to rate a session RPE? Now, this is a great question, and admittedly, there are a number of uncertainties around session RPE. So I'm going to try to be as honest and direct as possible without sort of riding the fence, as is my typical strategy. So, session RPE is a tool for monitoring an individual's training load. It has been used along with session duration to come up with a numerical sort of training load to keep track of an individual's workload over time. So, typically, you would rate somebody's training, the session RPE after the session, 0 to 10, and you multiply it by the duration of the session, you get a number. And so you could see, like, hey, how hard or how stressful theoretically was this session compared to something in the past, and on average here's my week of training, how stressful, how much workload was I doing compared to previous weeks. That's the idea. The units that are used are called arbitrary units, which kind of speaks to the lack of sort of validation of this tool. And this has previously been used in this like acute to chronic workload ratio that was used as a metric for injury risk reduction and prediction. But this has been controversial in recent times because when people have ascribed specific cutoffs, like, oh, this specific acute to chronic workload ratio, where you compared, this training loads from 1 week to the previous 4 weeks, we couldn't figure out a number that worked well enough that you could like hang your hat on and say, if you go above this, problems, or if you go below this, detraining.
Yeah, people have probably heard this, especially if they came from like the endurance aerobic world, where there's this common like 10% rule for, quote unquote rule for, aerobic or endurance training, where you shouldn't increase your running mileage or your volume by more than 10% in a given, period compared to the prior period. And it's like that's useful as a general concept. It's kind of almost like a commonsensical thing, like don't crank up the amount you're doing compared with what you're used to or what you're adapted to. But the validity of a particular quantity in terms of a percentage or a ratio, that's what it's like, we don't really have great evidence to support that. Injuries and pain and stuff is way more complicated than that and super individualized, right? So both you and I have had varying experiences with pain and injury over the years. We've had clients who we've coached, some who have been just like, insane. They can handle anything we throw at them and they just like never get hurt. And others who, seemingly deal with aches and pains, even, when we don't change their training volume all that much, and it just kind of emerges out of nowhere. So it's just, there's too much mess here to deal with like very specific amounts. But as
Yeah.
a concept, it's useful.
I agree. Yeah. And so, as far as the practical tool itself, the individual should answer after the training session is done, how hard was the workout? Using a scale 0 to 10, where 0 is rest, 5 is hard, 7 is very hard, and 10 is maximal. The data is limited on any specific ratio, as we mentioned, for acute to chronic workload. And the data is even more limited on a target sort of session RPE. That said, this is more of a checkbox item as far as how I use it. Where we'd like to see most training sessions in that sort of 3 to 5 range, few in the 7 or less than 3 range, and very rarely outside of that. If somebody was routinely, rating their session 10, 10, 10, 10, that's a dead giveaway that the training is too hard for the individual. As far as the source of that quote hardness, I don't know if it's volume, proximity to failure, rest periods, or a combination of factors. That's another question that would need to be answered, but that's a dead giveaway that, this probably isn't great. Similarly, if things are 2, 2, 2, 2, I think that the training is likely too easy for the individual. So it's kind of like a Goldilocks approach. You want it to be just right. As far as what's just right, I think most of the work should be in that session RPE of 3 to 5. And if it's way above that or way below that, I start getting concerned that we might have missed something when it comes to prescribing exercise for this individual.
Yeah, I actually texted you about this recently when it came to my attention that in the like Apple Fitness app, I had done my conditioning for the day and then it popped open. And now there's a way that you can basically rate the same thing. It's a little scale of 1 to 10. It's like a little purple dialog box that people who are on iPhone after this can probably look at. And you just pick how difficult it was to log that in there. And so it's been adopted by Apple. So it's out there. I would say, thinking back on most of my like strength training, including periods where I was training like, for maximum performance, I would say that most of my sessions, if I could put a session RPE on it, probably like 6 would I would say would be like my average session RPE for most of those like strength training sessions. And these days I'm doing, I'm not training quite as hard in that sense for the top end strength performance, but doing more conditioning. And most of my conditioning sessions 3 to 4 probably on average, and then I'll occasionally do a more challenging session, but most of it is relatively lower intensity, just to try to balance out all the cumulative stress that I'm experiencing across relatively high frequency training.
Yep. It's good feedback. All right, well, that is a wrap here on our 3rd edition of our Supercast Ask Me Anything. Again, this normally goes out to just our Barbell Medicine Plus subscribers, but you might have heard a tidbit of this in your regular feed. And we encourage you, if you want to support what we do here at Barbell Medicine, become a Barbell Medicine Plus member. That would really help us out. But before you guys go anywhere, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps drive traffic to our podcast so we can keep bringing you all the latest nuance in health and fitness. From everyone here at Barbell Medicine, special shout out to Dr. Austin Baraki for joining us. We'll catch you next week and every week right here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast.